Cool, thank you. I'm just going to start. Like I said, my name's Kevin Bridges. I'm from a company called Drud Technology. We focus on a couple of products that we like to develop. One's a local development tool. The other's a pretty major hosting platform. And we're going to talk about achieving DevOps Nirvana by putting one foot in front of the other. I don't know if any of you are Sesame Street fans, but there's an amazing episode that we'll cover in a little bit that hints at where that came from. And let's see, I can't go to the next slide. There we go. All right, so some of my contact information, Drupal.org/cyberswat. If you have a few minutes and you want to tweet any highlights from this, it's at cyberswat on Twitter. Use the hashtags #DDev, FLDC 2019. So basically, why do the first thing that I'm going to say is that if you're expecting a highly technical conversation coming from this session, you're not going to get it. So you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed. One of the things that I've basically been able to figure out over the course of time is that DevOps is a multifaceted tool. I've been doing DevOps for a very long time. I don't like the word DevOps, but it's what people associate with what I do. Basically, there's two components of DevOps. There's the systems component, there's the tools that you use, there's all the cool stuff that you hear about, the CI/CD, the testing, the integration, all the engineering stuff. But DevOps is also a cultural conversation. And that's the part that a lot of people tend to miss out on most of the time. So for us, what we've been able to figure out is, we've come from an agency into a product development company, into managing distributed teams of engineers, and trying to understand what it takes to get all of that to work together so that it turns into a cohesive conversation, so that it can become something that's predictable, that you can plan around, that you can basically create really cool things from. So some of the things that we're going to basically touch on in this session are, number one, the why, what, and how. Why do we need to think about small steps with DevOps? What are the challenges we're facing? How do we deal with some of these massive problems that we end up encountering? What is our goal? In order to understand what it is that you're building, you need to have goals, and you need to have a goal-setting system and an ability to execute on those goals so that you can continue to track not only what you're accomplishing and delivering, but where you are in the process and how well you're doing. So you need to understand when you're failing, what does that mean? And when you're succeeding, what does that mean? And how do you balance those out? How do you turn those into metrics? And then we're going to touch a little bit on how do we get there. What is the procedure to plan and map out our work? How can we get started executing our work? Very basic questions. So basically, we're all very ambitious people by nature. I mean, I might be speaking out of turn, but for me, being involved in Drupal has always been about self-motivation, about the desire to help people, the desire to help myself in the process, the desire to create really amazing things that people are going to use all over the world. And we've been very successful with the Drupal community and participating in the Drupal community, and it's literally changed our lives. So we're all doing very ambitious things individually or as teams, and it's amazing. It's great. But we need to be able to see the path ahead. We need to know how far we've come, and we need to keep focus on the things that are identifying where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. In the day-to-day process of delivering projects, it's easy to feel buried with no clear path for improving the situation we're in sight. So essentially what ends up happening, one of the very first large Drupal websites that I did was a site called popsci.com, and I don't even remember the Drupal version anymore. I think it was Drupal 6. But it was the first enterprise website on Drupal. And I remember the complexity of that project was significant. And the way that we broke it down basically involved a lot of sticky notes and whiteboard sessions. So when they came to us and had us start working on that project, they literally brought a requirements document in a 3-ring binder like that. So we had to go through and deal with a massive amount of complexity, break it down into manageable pieces, execute on those pieces, and then deliver a technology product that had never been delivered before. And I'm going to help share some of what we how we accomplished that. So I don't know, is that me just projecting, or have other people had that feeling? Like where you just kind of, you've got a new project, you want to accomplish it, you understand that there's a date maybe 6 months out, and then suddenly it's just panic. How do I get there? How do I break this apart? Does that resonate with anybody?
Sure.
Cool. So basically, let's start by saying what DevOps is and isn't, because I think it's really important. A lot of people misinterpret the word and misuse it quite a bit. So DevOps is discovering what needs to be done, defining a clear, measured path to doing it, and executing that path using tools that suit your needs. Decreasing complexity and increasing clarity to add maximum impact and automating where possible. So I don't know if that's really the standard definition that you'll find on the internet, because most people tend to take it from an engineering perspective. But for me, it's really about understanding where you're going, first and foremost, being able to predict how you're going to get there, understand what your velocity is, what your capabilities are, and then coming up with a system of execution that allows you to act on that. DevOps is not that one weird tip or magic pill that will solve all your problems. Installing a boatload of tools or trying to make someone else's methods and strategies work for you. So what does that mean? Basically, what ends up happening is a lot of people jump into the concept of DevOps or systems improvement or cultural improvement for their organization, and they immediately start pulling tools out of thin air. They're like, I heard this one's good, I heard this one's good, we're going to pull these together, these are going to solve all of our problems, and suddenly we have tool overload, we don't know how to use any of them effectively, and we're scrambling around trying to understand what it is that we're even doing. We're expending a lot of energy not going anywhere because we never identified where we were going. We just threw a bunch of tools in the way and heard that these were going to solve our problems. That's not DevOps. So basically, you need to define a goal. You always need to keep an end in sight. You need to orchestrate work leading to a sense of accomplishment and a clear stopping point. So a large part of this conversation is going to be about how do we actually set our goals, how do we execute on our goals, and then how do we measure the results of that so that we can bring it into alignment, so that we can tell a client that they're going to have their project on a certain date, and we know what our capacity is, we know what our ability to deliver is, and we can execute on that repeatedly. That's what we want from DevOps. And we want to do it as easily as possible. We don't want to be overwhelmed by the tools. We don't want to be overwhelmed with technical debt. We want it to work, and we want it to work simply. So, bit of a metaphor. I'm from Colorado. I like playing in the snow, and this is a hike that I did the other day. So if you've ever had the opportunity to do a hike like that, it's massive. It's a huge undertaking. You know, this one's at 13,000 feet, lack of oxygen. You're extending a lot of energy to get a very small distance. So basically, the way that your brain changes as you're doing these types of exertions or these types of adventures is very profound, because you go from, hey, here's this huge mountain that I'm going to climb, to, hey, here's this trail, I just need to take one more step. And I know if I keep taking that one more step, it doesn't matter what's behind me, I'm getting closer and closer to my goal until eventually I accomplish that. So breaking down complex problems into very simple, structured steps is an integral part of DevOps. Checklists are absolutely amazing, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So, burnout and balance. This is a quote that I think that I need to go over. And there's a bit.ly link down here in the bottom. It's bit.ly/rfa-ddev. But the quote is, people need to know that their life is more important than the project they are working on. And this came out of a DDev podcast that he did for OS training the other day. But it's a very profound thing. And if you know anything about Randy, he lives and breathes that. He was involved in governance very early on in the Drupal space. He burned out excessively in Drupal, contributing and participating with the community. It's a challenging thing sometimes. So if you don't balance the pressure of these larger projects and some of these more complex things that you're trying to undertake, and you don't do it in a structured way, not only will you burn yourself out, but you'll burn out the people that you're working with. You'll end up creating a culture where things cannot move forward, and it's very toxic. It's very dangerous. You won't get the best products, you won't get the best services, and you won't get the best people helping you achieve what your goals actually are unless you manage that properly. So what's our goal? Happy teams lead to regular delivery, of obtainable sized work chunk. Well, I screwed that up a little bit. So happy teams give us a couple of different things. So regular deliveries of obtainable sized work chunks that lead to delivery of the project in alignment with the project goals. I mean, that's ultimately what we want to do. It doesn't matter if we're servicing a single website for a client, or we're building a product, or we're trying to figure out how to fix the roof in our house. These skill sets apply across disciplines. Part of the goal and some of the things that we are going to cover is understanding how all of that translates. So you need to be able to talk to your team. You need to be able to understand their velocity. You need to understand the morale of the team. You need to take all of those things into consideration so that you can start coming up with a predictable way of being able to execute. And it's all pretty complicated. So I guess the question is really how do we keep track of it all, right? And no, it's real simple. You create a map. It sounds almost ridiculous. It's so simple. But in reality, most people don't have this, and it makes things very complicated. And it's proven. It's scientific. Like I have charts, I have numbers, I have lines. This came from Software Engineering Economics by a gentleman named Barry Boehm. This is a 1980s book that was created. And essentially what this is showing us is on the left side of the chart, you have the beginnings of a project. And you have down here maybe your business needs. Up here you have maybe your technical needs. And you're trying to align those to be able to deliver something. It could be a website, it could be a software project, it could be anything. On the left side, you're tending to be a 4x cost equation because you don't have the ability to understand what it is that you're doing yet. And you'll see as time progresses in the life cycle of that, it gets closer and closer to where you have the business and the technical in alignment. And the second that you're able to align those things, and you have the programmer understanding of specifications, you have the detailed design specifications in there, there are no more questions, everybody understands the map, how they're going to execute it, then suddenly things align and start moving forward in a predictable fashion. And that's kind of what we're going for. So a lot of this may seem a little abstract and not technical, but this is all based in very real premises. So basically, I don't know why I threw a Dora map in here, but it seems pretty applicable. If you have a complex project, you need to break it up. And if you know what those components are, you can execute on them. Maybe not effectively, but you can at least execute on them. And then you can record the results and get better and better at it. So why is the question that a good strategy seeks to answer? So one of the key benefits of this is, let's say, I take 3 people from this room and I say, hey, we're going to move this table into the cafeteria. 3 people are going to have possibly 3 different concepts of how that should happen. And you're all trying to achieve the same goal, but it's loosely defined, and so there's not going to be a lot of alignment there. You might have people pulling in different directions on the table. One might want to take it down front and center off the stage. The other might want to take it off to the right. You think you're doing the exact same thing, but in reality, you're not aligned. And that's the same thing that happens in software development. Hey, I want to make a web page that has a node carousel across the top and maybe a couple columns with some content in it. That sounds pretty simple, but everybody in the room is going to have a different definition of what that actually means. And that's kind of what we're trying to address a little bit. So in order to identify what you're doing and where you're going, you need to start by defining why you're doing this work. What are the goals? What are your company's goals? You need to put those across the top of a billboard so that everybody understands them. You need to state them clearly, and then you need to keep people aligned with them. And you need to make sure that all of the work that you're doing on that project aligns with those goals across the board. So every task that comes into the system should align to a goal. It should align to initiative, and it should help support the overall concept of what you're trying to achieve. And if that isn't happening and you can't directly connect those lines, then it's very likely that people are working on things that are not productive to the end goal. And that happens a lot in software engineering, right? So I've seen instances where, half dozen brilliant engineers are working together in a room and they're trying to achieve a project, and then suddenly it's like, well, why are you working on this system? Well, because we need that. Well, no, we don't need that because we're actually going in this direction. And that conversation is a very real thing. So we're going to show you a little bit about how we do it. So in order to execute and achieve all of this, you need to have a plan. So for us, being DDev, being the fact that we're a product company, number one is identifying what our plan is, what our goals are, why we're doing what we're doing, and what is the motivation for doing what we're doing. So for us, we have our vision, an open source-based company creating the first installable dev-to-deploy technology. We have our mission. Using our open source ethos, we change the way the world builds the web and digital transformations happen. They're not minor goals. They're pretty large. Position, an end-to-end solution from local development to testing to staging to production that is flexible, customizable, and installable on public, private, and hybrid clouds, as well as on-premise hardware where clients can pay for what they use. The opportunity that is initiating all of this is we want to capture $3 billion of our $16 billion total addressable market. We're looking at a subset of the $154 billion global hosting market. These are the things that we need to help get everybody on the same page. Why are you working for this company? Why are you participating in this project? What is the end goal of this project, and what are you trying to achieve? Well, we lay it out for everybody to see. We take a look at our threats. We understand the weaknesses that we need to address, and we understand what our strengths are. We lay all those out so that they're well understood and can be communicated. Now that you have a basic understanding of kind of where you're going, you need to start looking at some of the different components that are necessary to do it. And some of those components basically for us are the concept of we have goals. Those goals happen on a quarterly basis. Then we have initiatives. Those initiatives can support multiple goals, but they're basically a bucket where you can start dumping common functionality. Out of initiatives, you have several master features, or epics, as a lot of people call them. But those are maybe smaller buckets that allow you to define what something's going to be doing. So in this example, we have a goal of present at Drupalcamp, for example. The initiative that we're supporting by presenting at Drupalcamp is community outreach. And if I go through and outline it all correctly, the previous slide that had our company's goals, I can draw a line that shows you how that initiative supports one of those boxes. And it's important to keep things aligned that way. So another initiative that we're supporting as a result of this is brand awareness. You can have initiatives that scale different things. Inside of the initiatives, you have a series of epics. So, for example, publicize the session could be an epic. That is an epic because there's several tasks. Number one, I have to put the session together. Number two, I have to give the session. Number three, I have to find a way to publicize it. Number four, I have to find the website to publicize it on. There's a series of steps that are necessary to achieve things. And checklists are awesome. You don't need software to figure this stuff out. You write a checklist, you write down all the tasks that are necessary to accomplish it, you keep it very simple intentionally, and then you execute against that plan. And that's essentially how we create maps to improve the DevOps process. Again, it sounds really simple, but it's not. It's not something that a lot of people are doing, because what ends up happening is you get so involved in the day-to-day and you get so overwhelmed by the client pressures or the excitement of writing new code or new technology. Hey, I can just jump in and bang this thing out and I'll be done in 30 seconds and it'll be great. And that never happens. So I don't know. It's all pretty interesting to me. Here's an example of kind of what some of this starts to look like. And as you start to get more insight into kind of your systems and your teams and how people are working across the board. So basically, one of the things that I think is really important to show here is we're going to touch on the concept of velocity and what that actually means. But here we have a team that's been my team that's been in active development. And when you have short lines like what you see at the top, those are items that were put into a 2-week sprint, essentially. And we said that at the beginning, we commit to achieving this work. One of the challenges that you tend to have with software engineering teams is they overcommit. And this is a prime example of that. So in the next block of lines, what you see down here when we move from Q1 Sprint 4 into Q1 Sprint 5 is several lines that go over to the left and kind of interact with where the ones at the top were. What that means are those were items that were originally in that Q4 sprint that the team overcommitted to, that they weren't able to meet and basically didn't execute properly on. Now, the goal and the reason that we do this is to help teams understand that it is more important to be able to specify accurately what you're going to be able to accomplish in a sprint, every single sprint, than it is to not achieve the sprint. So in a goal-setting paradigm, like our company goals, we have a 60 to 70% rule. If I say, hey, I want to deliver X, Y, and Z by the end of the quarter, we have an expectation that we're only going to meet 60 to 70% of that. Because it's a very large, complex goal. There's a lot of things that can happen along the way. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, when it comes down to the sprint planning and the velocity, we're not fuzzy like that. We need to be accurate. The more accurate that we are, the better it's going to inform our decisions, the better it's going to be able to set expectations further and further upstream, the more we're going to understand how to communicate what we're doing and be able to associate deadlines and times with it that non-engineering people need to see. Moving into the current sprint, basically what you see is an overview of what's happening. We have a smaller amount of items. We've figured out, and if you recall that line chart that I showed earlier, there's a point where you have to have everything defined before anybody can start to work on it. You can't say, hey, Mr. Engineer, Miss Engineer, go build me this thing and just take care of it, take it off my plate. You have to actually define it. You have to put a technical specification behind it. You have to give it good acceptance criteria. You have to help your engineers or the people that you're working with understand what it is that you even need done in the first place. You can't just assume through some random telemetry that people are going to be able to understand what to deliver. And it takes a lot of work to define this stuff to a degree that is necessary to be executed on. The pink lines that you see here, the different colored lines, those are variations of things that we do. So the gold ones are things that are done. The green ones are actionable, can be assigned to somebody. The pinkish ones need a little bit more definition, either from product or from technical. And we basically have it set up so that in a standardized sprint, we have time allocated for engineers to go through and do technical research in addition to engineering, so that basically the expectation isn't, okay, well, we have everything slammed in a sprint. It's all engineering work. Here's your full-time job. We need to deliver this in 2 weeks. Oh, yeah, and on the side, can you do all these technical specifications for me because we need to get next sprint lined up? That doesn't balance out very well. You need to understand your capacity. You need to set realistic expectations so that if you have somebody who is a valuable engineer, for example, and they're doing a lot of coding, you need to break that person out of that paradigm so that they can help others understand what they're working on, what their vision is for the architecture, or what it is that they're trying to accomplish. They need to get that documented. They need to have the right time to be able to do it. You can't just expect them to pull it out of thin air. You know, that's the unicorn comment that you may have heard of earlier. So development is basically how it all happens. And this is just an example checklist. It's not complicated. The very first step to everything is literally writing it out. You don't need a computer to do it. You can do it on sticky notes. You can do it on a whiteboard. Identify the exact steps that you need to execute and basically keep track of them. So if a pattern ends up developing in certain situations, like this particular one, infrastructure changes, update cloud formation template, deploy environment and code, check to make sure everything works. These are basically epics. That infrastructure changes would be kind of an initiative or a goal, essentially. So each of the epics are the beginning of this checklist, and each of those epics have a whole series of tasks that are very similar to this that can be represented in a checklist fashion. Once you have these checklists in place, and it sounds silly, it sounds so simple, but once you put them in place, you can execute on them repeatedly. And not only can you execute on them repeatedly, but you can hand them off to somebody else who can then execute on them repeatedly and consistently, doing with predictable results. And once you have that, then you have the ability to automate it. Then you start looking at the tools that can make your life easier. Then you start figuring out how to do CI/CD. But you don't even lift a finger in that direction until you understand what it is that you're doing first and how you accomplish it. And it's all simple, common sense stuff, but it's so hard to keep track of when you're in the day-to-day trying to deliver products. So for us, we use a lot of different tools. Basically, as I was saying, everything should kind of sync back up. So for us, what we have here is we have a specific task that's following inside of a specific sprint. From an engineering perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But from an overall management perspective, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because I can't look at this list and tell you what I'm actually doing. Like, I can't tell you what initiatives that supports or what goals that's accomplishing or if the person working on this is actually even doing anything that's associated with where we want to take the product or where we want to go. So the way that we do that is we come back over here, and these are basically tied into GitHub, so they go down into a specific issue in GitHub. And then here we have the ability to associate both with an initiative and then with specific goals that we're trying to accomplish for the company. And again, very simple stuff, but you have to lay it out, you have to draw it out, and then you have to draw the lines to make sure that everything that you're working on associates to where you actually want to go. And again, that sounds really simple and straightforward, but a lot of people end up dealing with a very complex problem, and they get stuck. They don't know where to go next. They don't know what to do next. And just the simple practice of linking these things together in this fashion will help give you a map that will help guide you to the next step, that will let you know what that next little step is that you need to take, that will be able to be evaluated on a regular basis, that will be able to give you a consistent metric to let you know that you're moving the needle in the direction that it needs to go in consistently. Pretty cool stuff, actually. So how do we actually get there? I think I kind of touched on this a little bit, but you define the plan, you track the work, you expose the progress, and then you repeat. And once you understand it, if it makes sense, you automate it. You might expose unplanned things in the process. If it's stopping you from accomplishing your work, it kind of needs to be removed. So for example, I don't know what a good example is, but let's say you have a support request from your client come through, and that support request sounds like it's just napalm, the world's on fire, everything needs to be fixed right now. But if you're focusing on product development at the same time, that fire that's very important to that customer may disrupt you from what you're doing. So a good way to respond to set those expectations with the customer might be to say, hey, well, here's where your fire falls in the list of priorities and the timelines that we have outlined. And I understand that this isn't very important for you right now, but if we work it this way and maybe you just give us a week or two, then you're going to find that the solution that you end up with is going to be something that not only solves your problem, but puts you in a very positive place. And that might be a bad example, but it's definitely one that we've been able to utilize as a result of this. It's all about expectation setting. You set the expectations with the engineers. You set the expectation with the people that are defining what the engineers need to be working on. You set the expectation with the people that may be funding that. You set the expectation with the customer. And suddenly everybody knows what to expect. So back to that analogy of moving the table. It's not a question of, okay, well, here's 3 people and we think the table might get out there one day. It's more along the lines of, well, now we all know what we're doing. We all know what we can expect, and this is how we move things forward. It's a cohesive conversation, and it's a very important one. So let's take a look. One of the things that you need to do to be able to understand how to measure any of this, because measurement is a key component of DevOps, is to look at what you're capable of doing in a very realistic fashion. And what we have here is a spreadsheet that we use that allows us to predict our velocity. It tells us what we've done in the previous sprints, and then it keeps a running list from sprint to sprint so that we have the ability to go through and for example, look at, what is this, Q1-5, we basically said that we were going to be able to commit to 108 story points. So as you go through and you work with your checklists and you create your tasks, once you get down to a task level, you need to size them in some way. That means assigning points to them. They can be arbitrary points, but they have to be consistently applied. And for us, we basically use that point system to say, hey, this is the effort necessary to achieve this task as we understand it. And then you can use those points to be able to correlate, well, based off of our point system, we have 5 tasks in the queue, so we know that that's going to be 108 epic points. And then basically, at the end of the sprint, we have a reconciliation so that we know how many we actually accomplished. And now when you go back to the initial statement of we need to bring the engineering team in alignment with delivery, basically what that means is that the engineering team starts to see these numbers and understand, hey, we just moved from a chaotic world where we were never finishing sprints to suddenly, hey, we're moving stuff out of the sprint because we're aligning it closer with what our actual capacity is. And we do that by looking at the ideal days that somebody's going to be in there, available to work, the holidays that they may need to account for, the time off that they may need to account for, people that may not be 100% allocated because you may have a very brilliant engineer that is the bottleneck for everything, and everybody goes to that person for all of the answers, but you need to pull them out of engineering so that they can define what they're thinking so that all those other people that have to go to them to get answers can instead execute on what they're thinking. And you have to account for that in this way. So you'll see where people drop down base ideal days or something like that to be able to account for additional work that they're doing. If you don't have the ability to identify what people need to do throughout the course of the day and their capacity to accomplish it, then you're not going to be able to predict your velocity. If you can't predict your velocity, you will never accurately be able to tell a customer when you're going to be able to deliver a specific product. It doesn't matter if it's a website, it doesn't matter what it is. A lot of times people get lucky. I spent most of my career getting really lucky at that. How long is it going to take to deliver PopSci? Oh, 6 months. Okay, cool. And somehow we pull it off. But many late nights, lots of stress, not a good way of doing anything. This is a much better way of doing it. Once you can predict your velocity, once you have a unit of measurement, then it starts to make sense across the board. The other thing that's very important to really talk about is the concept of a blameless culture, right? So that goes to kind of these numbers down here. I know they're not very poignant, but what happens when you have such a discrepancy is that people can't be held accountable for it. So what that means is that you just need to understand, hey, we messed up. We didn't do what we set out to do, and we need to adjust as a result of it. So we follow another process that gives us, at the end of each sprint, have everybody go through, identify what worked for them during that sprint, what didn't work for them during that sprint, and then how to make it better. And you can't hold anybody responsible for anything. So like here, you get, negative feedback. Well, I don't know if negative's the right word, but you get feedback. This is not specific to the sprint, though it showed itself this sprint. We are not doing enough to evaluate products and alternatives. Part of this has been due to some of us, especially myself, being spread thin. So basically what that is this kind of a little bit of a, hey, we're not doing something right. If this person wasn't comfortable surfacing that information, we may never end up with that information. We may make bad decisions that cause more engineering because we're not properly evaluating the tools that we could possibly bring in to let us focus on what it is that we really want to deliver, which is our IP, the things that make us unique. So just creating an environment where people can have a mechanism to surface that, they know that on a regular basis they're going to be able to give this feedback and that it's going to be heard and acted on, very critical components of the entire process, and something that I definitely encourage everybody to take a look at. So basically it's kind of real simple, and I almost feel like I'm missing the point because it is so simple. Map out your destination goals, plan how to get there, choose how you're going to take the steps, and then evaluate how you're doing. and then repeat. And if you do that and you record the information properly and you understand what your velocity is and you have good feedback mechanisms in place, then suddenly you're going to move from a system where everything's chaos. I don't know if I'm going to be able to hit this deadline next week, and I need to stress about it, and everybody else is going to stress about it as a result, to suddenly now I know that I'm going to be able to hit that deadline next week because I know my velocity, I know what my team's capable of, I know, and a team can be one person. It doesn't have to be a mass group of people. But you need to understand where you're going, how you're going to get there, and how fast you're going to be able to accomplish it. And I think that these are good concepts that will give you the ability to do that. Once you move into, we'll get things you can try at home. Basically, sticky notes are amazing. If you start off, let me see real quick. I'll skip it. So if you start off with just sticky notes and say, hey, in the next 3 months, the next quarter, I want to accomplish this. I want to move this needle this far. I want to accomplish this thing. I want to accomplish this thing. And I want to accomplish this thing. You typically come up with 3 to 5 very large goals for yourself or for your organization. Those goals, like I said, have a typical success rate of 60 to 70%. And then you start to break it down into those initiatives that are going to make sense. So, for example, if you have a specific client that needs X, Y, and Z functionality, and you're building, for us, it would be a product, and you want to expose that functionality to other customers that might need it, the initiative might be named after a specific customer that you're going for, or a specific target that you're trying to achieve. And it kind of all ties together very well. It makes a lot of sense, especially once you start to put velocity on it. You start to size up the tasks that are necessary to accomplish it. You have somebody that is essentially a task master that is keeping people aligned with them. So for us, what that means is that we have a daily stand-up, and in that daily stand-up, it's not, hey, let's talk about what might be blocking you randomly. I want you to give me the exact ticket number you're working on so that I can look and see how that ticket maps to initiatives, that maps to goals, and I need to evaluate what's happening on a daily basis to make sure that everybody's moving in the same direction constantly. And it's very easy, you'd be surprised, it's very easy to find that really passionate creative engineers tend to drift because they get excited about things or they get pulled into rabbit holes. And it's really important to stay focused and stay on task. So basically, this all came about as a result of a freaking Sesame Street show, which was awesome. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but if you have the chance, there's the link to it, dailymotion.com/whatever. But the entire concept of the episode is just really amazing and has a lot of good messages for DevOps today. This is Snuffleupagus, or Snuffy, basically completely scared to death of learning to roller skate. And this is Big Bird's birthday bash. And during this bash, Big Bird takes the time to explain to him, you just have to put one foot in front of the other. You just take one additional step. Identify what it is that you want to accomplish, lay it out in a clear, defined way, and then have the courage to take that next step. And it's okay if you fall. We all do. So just learn from it and then get up and take the next step. And that's essentially what we're accomplishing with DevOps. I mean, this is more the cultural side of it. It's not the technical side of it. But like I said, DevOps isn't technology. It's about moving things through the system. It's about getting things done in a repeatable fashion. It's about a good culture to be able to create amazing tools, amazing experiences for your customers and for the people that you want to create for. I think it's pretty neat. I think it's pretty cool. But I guess that's basically it. So we've got about 4 more minutes. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear them. Okay, sure.
So you acknowledge that the term DevOps can be a little ambiguous.
Yes.
Your own definition of it might not be the same as others. I don't know what DevOps is exactly.
Okay.
But for you, how is DevOps different than project management? It feels to me like this was project management.
Yep. So DevOps, project management is a component of DevOps. So for us, DevOps is basically, a cultural conversation, which means setting the right expectations, really helping people understand what it is they're achieving, and then it's also the technical side of it. So understanding where it makes a lot of sense to pull in the right CI/CD tool, the right code sniffing tools, the right testing tools, whatever it is. For me, it's an entire package. Many people just segment DevOps into the technical side of it and say, oh, well, if I install Jenkins, then I'm doing DevOps. No, that's not true. It's like if you have a toolbox and you go out to your car and you set the toolbox on the hood of the car, that doesn't make you a mechanic by any stretch of the imagination. So basically, for me, it's a cultural conversation. It's the project management side of it. It's the product management side of it. It's defining what needs to be built. Letting people define the technical side of how it needs to be built. It all creates a whole system that, to me, becomes DevOps. Yes?
So, I have a couple of questions. We have been trying to implement this whole DevOps methodology and approach into an Ajax environment. And most of the talks that I've been to so far have been kind of focused on product design, where those things don't necessarily mesh together. So, we've tried to adopt the same principles, but we've run into stumbling blocks in two of the things that you mentioned. The first being the funnel of uncertainty. I love that graphic. It's something that we grapple with every day when we're trying to estimate budgets for like new projects coming in and stuff like that. How far down the funnel can we go before we have a pretty decent idea of how much the project is actually going to cost? And like where that stopping point is. That's the first question. And the second question is, we've been using all the estimates rather than story points because we simply just don't know how to assign a score to the user stories that we're creating. So if you could give us some information as to what methodology you use to assign scores to user stories, and
Sure.
definitely touch on the whole notion of the uncertainty funnel and when we should actually be setting budget costs. How far down the funnel should we be setting it?
So you need to have a couple of projects under your belt, kind of like how we were seeing those different sprints and seeing, on the right the numbers were vastly different, on the left they were coming closer and closer together. Same concept in business, right? You may not understand it at first, but really the convergence point is once you have the ability to firmly explain to the engineers or the people doing the technical work what it is that needs to be delivered. They understand it the same way that the people asking for it understands it. That's when you have that convergence and you can associate your velocity with it. So those three components. You have to be able to define what it is, it has to be able to be understood what it is, and then it has to have velocity associated with it. It might take you a little bit of time to get those velocity numbers down, and that's kind of more your second question. And I'm going to throw a tool at you that we use. It's called planningpoker.com. So basically, a lot of people use the Fibonacci sequence. I probably slaughtered that pronunciation, but it basically is just an arbitrary number system. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 13, and that's it. It can be completely arbitrary. Planning Poker ties into Slack for us. So when we have a ticket that is not estimated properly, we have a label inside of GitHub that says this needs scope, it needs definition. And it stays that way until we have a velocity number associated with it. When we don't have that velocity number, we throw it into a Slack chat room. The bot basically pings everybody and says, hey, I need an estimate on this specific ticket. Everybody goes through and you get to see the results in the Slack room. So there are tools out there that will help facilitate that. Planningpoker.com is a really good one that can help you assign metrics to it. Then we use another tool called ZenHub, which sits on top of GitHub and basically allows the concept of epics and it allows the concept of story points to be associated with the issues so that you can surface those in different ways.
So Planning Poker compiles people's opinion about how long that should take?
Yeah, so if you've ever sat in a planning meeting around the table and been like, okay, let's size this specific issue. What does everybody think it's going to take to accomplish this? And everybody comes up with a number. It's basically an automated system that will allow and facilitate that, but tie it through Slack so that it doesn't even have to be a meeting. And that's another thing that I didn't touch on. Meetings are freaking toxic. And unorganized meetings especially are toxic. If you go into a meeting, you need to have an agenda set out. You need to have your objectives set, same as everything else that we talked about. Understand what your goal of the meeting is, set an agenda for the meeting, and then execute on it effectively and take away actionable items. Don't ever have a meeting where people are just arbitrarily sitting around a table doing something inefficient like throwing numbers up into the air. Come up with better systems and better ways of doing that so that you can be respectful of everybody's time.
Other than planning poker, what was the other one you mentioned?
ZenHub.
ZenHub is the one that sits on top of GitHub, and the Gantt charts and some of the other initiative planning stuff that I was showing screenshots of, that's another product called aha.io, AAHA.io, and that's what we use for a lot of our product management. Yep.
I very much enjoyed that this was not a technical talk. I noticed in the velocity planning spreadsheet that you have that there was a column for happiness.
Yes.
Can you talk about how this is measured and how it impacts the planning?
Right. So basically, we have happiness and we have confidence. So you need to understand the morale of the people that are working on a project, because low morale people are unlikely to be productive. High morale people are likely to be very productive because they're motivated, right? So when we go through and we outline all of the items that we have inside of a sprint, we go through and take a look at the total points necessary for it. Then we ask the question, how do you feel about achieving this in this sprint? Do you think it's realistic that we're going to be able to achieve it based on everything else that you've been going through? What's your general state of happiness? And it's an arbitrary number, just like everything else, but it does give us a metric that allows people to explain to us how confident they are about being able to achieve what they're doing. So what this is telling me is essentially here I have a lot of happiness, but I have relatively low confidence. So that means that the sprint plan, even though we have committed story points of 55, may be a bit more aggressive because of the complexity of what's happening in there than people are comfortable dealing with. This one, I have two options with at that point. So number one, I have the ability to adjust the plan a little bit to kind of deal with that, and I can have that conversation during sprint planning. Or number two, I can let it ride because happiness is quite high, morale's still in a good place, and we have very challenging things that we need to do, so I'm going to let that one go and see where those numbers come back. And then I can make an informed decision that says, okay, well, next sprint, I end up with a scenario where everybody's happiness is really high, confidence is mediocre, and then I can look back at this sprint and say, hey, well, we didn't meet this, we missed it by 10 points or something like that. And then moving forward, because I have this data and those metrics, I can start adjusting. So the next time I see that scenario, I can say, well, we need to take a couple of issues out, we need to change a couple of things and kind of get those numbers more in alignment.
If everyone's happiness is very low, do you do like company vacation time? Or? Just kidding.
We'll have that conversation
What we
a little
want to
bit.
know is that have you managed to find a mathematical correlation between happiness and the ability to achieve all the story points you have in a particular sprint period?
How we found that mathematical
Is there
correlation?
one? I know
I
you're
don't.
just using it as a guide, but is there actually a coefficient that you can multiply the story points by to see how much you'll actually be able
There
to
might
achieve?
be, but we're not using it. Happiness to me is an emotion. It's not really a measurable thing. So for us, I mean, this is a combination of science and feeling, I guess. So there's a lot of science associated with it, but at the same time, there's a human part, and you have to deal with that human part. And if you don't deal with it, then it doesn't work. So I don't know a way to quantify that properly. Cool. Any more questions? Or let's see. What do we got? I think there's one more sign. So I was supposed to leave this one up last. I'm at Drud. My name's at CyberSWAT. Sign up for our newsletter, drud.com. Hello, DDev. Jordana's going to be in here just after lunch at 1 o'clock, kind of continuing on this general theme of building really good teams and executing properly. And then later this afternoon, we're going to be in a panel in rooms 172 about local development environments, and you'll hear a little bit more about DDev Local, about Lando, about a couple of the tools out there. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.